In part 2 of this series, I identified 4 moral problems with democracy. The first is that the concept of the people implicates even dissenting minorities in unjust policies that the state may carry out. The second is that it is unjust because it is inherently oppressive of dissenting individuals. And the third is that it is unjust because it is illegitimate. Additionally, I pointed to a tendency in democratic thought and practice towards totalitarianism. In this essay, I will make the case that a sacred monarchy addresses all of these issues. The point of entry into this argument is to explicate why, precisely, the totalitarian dimension of democracy is objectionable. Indeed, I will argue that democracy's totalitarianism constitutes yet another injustice. Totalitarianism, as was stated in the previous installment, is usually, and incorrectly, used to mean extreme authoritarianism. Ultra-authoritarianism is not the substance of totalitarianism, but a means to achieving it. In the liberal societies most Anglophones inhabit, it is the radical authoritarianism of communist and fascist totalitarianism which is usually the grounds for objecting to it. In what follows, I will explain why one should reject totalitarianism as such, and not only the ultra-authoritarianism that it has historically given rise to. To appreciate why totalitarianism tout court is objectionable, we must first have some understanding of caste. Caste is not a uniquely Hindu phenomenon, although the Hindu faith articulates it most clearly. To appreciate why totalitarianism tout court is objectionable, we must have some understanding of caste. Caste is not a uniquely Hindu phenomenon, although the Hindu faith articulates it most clearly. The doctrine of caste is that the quality of the human soul differs between individuals. These differences determine individuals' psycho-spiritual predispositions, and thus both the spiritual path of realization most appropriate for them and their earthly vocation. This recognition of qualitative differences between individuals necessitates a profound rejection of the idea of equality. Not everyone can do everything. People are not interchangeable. Certain people are suited to certain tasks and roles. Politics is the concern of the warrior, or in Sanskrit, Kshatriya caste. As was argued previously in part 2, politics is in essence violent. Violence is equally essential to the psycho-spiritual constitution of the warrior. Warriors are born with a predisposition to action, and violence is action in its most concentrated expression. The spirituality of the warrior is therefore defined by an intense activity, what in Hinduism is called karma yoga. The warrior's spirituality is such that violence, under the right conditions, can be a salubrious and transformative experience that leads to transcendence. For people of different natures, that is to say, of different caste, and this comprises the vast majority of humanity, violence can only be experienced as something hellish, disfiguring both the body and the soul. For the non-warrior to engage in violence, more often than not, debases them inwardly to the state of the bestial at best and the demonic at worst. This can be seen, for example, in the tragically all too frequent occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder in modern soldiers, the vast majority of whom are not warriors. The spirituality of the warrior is reflected in their social functions, making war, administering justice, and governance. In a word, politics. Justice, you will recall, consists in each doing their proper duty and receiving their proper rewards. With this in mind, what is unjust about the totalitarian aspect of democracy is that it forces individuals of all castes to engage with the task of the warriors. Just as combat degrades the non-warrior, so too do other dimensions of politics. The political, as Carl Schmitt observed, is defined by the friend-enemy distinction. For the non-warrior, engagement brings with it great moral and spiritual danger. The politicization of the masses means that citizens come to view great swathes of their fellow citizens, to whom they felt at worst a benign indifference, as enemies. This flies in the face of the injunction to love thy neighbor. Part of the spirit of the warrior is the need to conquer himself inwardly and thus practice restraint in dealing with enemies, a kind of martial asceticism where struggle is engaged in without personal malice. This is perhaps the chief instruction of the Bhagavad Gita and was demonstrated most dramatically historically by the fourth caliph and first Shia Imam, Ali. The warrior can extend this inner attitude of selfless detachment from the battlefield to the struggle for and application of power within the state. Such a given capacity is lacking particularly in the lower castes, who comprise the great mass of any given society. This has, to some extent, been recognized by recent profane scholarship on politics. Jason Brennan, in Against Democracy, presents a trichotomy of political actors: Vulcans, hobbits, and hooligans. Vulcans engage in politics in a perfectly dispassionate manner. Hobbits are completely and contentedly disinterested in politics. Hooligans are engaged in politics with the mindset that it is to be approached as a tribalistic brawl. Most people, says Brennan, are hobbits, but should they become engaged in politics, they are more likely to become hooligans than Vulcans. Aiken and Bartels depict politics itself as being an essentially unprincipled matter of identity vindication. On their account, people engage in politics much the same way supporters engage in spectator sport. This kind of behavior, much like Brennan's hooligans, can be seen as a consequence of the inability of the masses to restrain themselves in engaging in friend-enemy relations. Aiken and Bartels' perspective is excessively cynical, a common occurrence in modernity. Most people become engaged in politics as a function of their will to the good, a subject I discussed at length in my doctoral thesis. However, the combination of their inward lack of restraint and the outward lack of consequences for their political allegiances, unless one is a member of the elite, your political preferences most likely have a nugatory influence on policy outcomes, means that engagement with politics most often degrades into the kind of tribalism Aiken and Bartels describe. It is simply unfair to foist politics upon the masses and expect them not to morally compromise and degrade themselves in this manner. It is unjust and cruel to expect a Vaishya or Shudra to perform as a Kshatriya would. It is much like throwing a dog off a cliff and expecting it to fly away rather than to plunge to its death. Here, there is truth in the Democrats' reticence to ever hold the masses to account for their votes, for the masses are the reality which the people mask. The masses cannot be held to account, not because they are infallible, but because they are not competent to be so held, much as children or the insane cannot be held criminally liable as an adult of sound mind can. Here too, we find the injustice of acts like bin Laden's, even if they did not only target individuals. Here too, we find the injustice of acts like bin Laden's, even if they did only target individuals who voted for aggression against Muslims. Not being capable of restraining themselves as warriors can, priority is given in the injunctions placed upon the masses to be simply obedient to heaven and loving of their fellows, this love being a manifestation of recognizing heaven as immanent in the hearts of those around us. To demand that these people engage in politics is to demand too much of them, and so to endanger their ability to love their fellows for very little discernible gain. It is sometimes said that democracy ennobles the common man, but it is difficult to see how this could be when it forces them to see so much of humanity as their foes. Democracy is unjust because it demands that people do work other than that which is proper to them. Not so in a monarchy. In sacred monarchy, politics is the concern of the warrior caste, led by the most preeminent in their number, the king. In this order, warriors are political elites, practically by definition, and are so afforded optimal conditions to fulfill their functions and thus attain the spiritual path most appropriate to them. Meanwhile, those of other castes are not forced into these roles, but instead fulfill the social functions and hence follow the route to spiritual attainment best suited to their constitutions. It should also be obvious that in this system, dissenting minorities are not implicated in unjust policies. Responsibility for policy lies with the political elites alone. Unlike democracy, sacred monarchy has no problem of legitimacy. Legitimacy is not conferred from a fiction, but from a reality, namely heaven. Or more precisely, legitimacy flows down from ultimate reality to conditioned reality, rather than legitimacy being drawn up from the relatively lesser reality of a social construct to the relatively greater reality of the material exercise of political power. The latter is frankly a nonsense, as it violates the well-known metaphysical axiom that the greater cannot come from the lesser. In a sacral monarchy, the priestly caste, the representatives of the absolute, and the preservers of ultimate reality's self-disclosure in the form of revelation, confer legitimacy upon the warrior caste, while the warrior caste subordinates itself to the priesthood. This is symbolized in the Western tradition in the anointing and crowning of the emperor by the Pope. In older traditions, according with earlier and less degraded times, the chief priest and chief warrior were united in a single person, who often participated ontologically in the absolute. One thinks here of the Caesars of Rome, or perhaps of the earliest Japanese emperors. Rule according to the will of heaven is not oppressive, unlike rule by the majority, dispensing, as we already have, with notions of the rule of the people and the consent of the governed. This is because the rule of the majority is quantitative, while the rule of heaven is qualitative. The rule of the majority makes its claim on superiority of number. Recalling the metaphysical principle referred to in the previous paragraph, quality is anterior to quantity because pure quality can exist alone, while pure quantity cannot. Quantity is therefore conditioned by quality, while the inverse is not true. Quality is therefore greater than quantity, and so quality cannot be arrived at by the amassing of mere quantity. Correctness cannot be arrived at by majority opinion in itself. This could just be a multiplication of error. Imposing a decision on a minority because it is the majority opinion therefore amounts to oppression. Two men have no right over one man as such, only the might of quantity. The absolute has the quality of being good, and conformity with its will is therefore good by definition, because any discrete good is only good by virtue and to the extent to which it participates in the absolute's goodness. Bringing dissenters into conformity with law sanctioned by heaven is not oppressive, as heaven does have right over the dissenter because it is the measure of all right. Furthermore, such coercion is not oppressive because it is in line with the desire of every individual's higher self, their fitra. To repeat, sacral monarchy is essentially legitimate where democracy is not. This does not mean that it is not capable of producing abuses. This needs stressing because it is so alien to the modern mind that an essentially legitimate system can still produce abuses of power. The modern, denying the existence of any superior plane of reality, cannot tolerate the notion that our terrestrial existence is imperfectible. This is the root of the communist and fascist intolerance for public complaint, a feature that was alien to traditional societies. For the liberal democrat, abuses must be an ultimately fixable result of some defect in institutional design and not an unavoidable fact of our fallen state. Said fallen state, the fact that all human history takes place in the declining phase of the historical cycle, necessitates imperfections in all political arrangements, no matter how legitimate. All rule, and we will qualify this statement presently, requires the violation of basic moral precepts, precepts universal to all traditions, as a matter of course. I have already discussed the inextricability of violence from governance. I have also suggested that theft is almost universally necessary for rule. To this we can add lying. It is impossible to manage a mass society without employing mendacities on a semi-regular basis. Indeed, anyone with children will know it is hard enough to manage only a few people without telling untruths. How is one, even with the best intentions, to govern millions without resorting to dishonesty? In more primordial times, when humanity was closer to the perfection of heaven, this was not necessary. In the original state, when every person was of priestly caste, no need was had for rulers. It was only with decline that variegation of human types came about. In its earliest phases, rulers were able to rule purely by moral example. As Kongzi describes, lower people would spontaneously submit to their betters as grass bends when the wind blows. This is less far-fetched than the viewer may initially think. Many of us can recall the commanding power of a person we recognize to be our better. This magnetic power is what Chinese tradition calls De, as in the title of the well-known text Dao De Jing. De is usually translated as power, but is perhaps better understood as carrying the connotation of both authority and virtue. Rule, according to De, is quite plausible when A. Human quality is greater such that rulers consistently have sufficient De, and B. Populations small enough that rulers can have enough personal interaction with all they rule over that their De can be exercised over the latter. As decline continues, this system becomes untenable for two reasons. Firstly, the moral qualities of humans degenerates such that the ruler's stock of De becomes depleted and the ruled become less responsive to it. Secondly, populations grow such as rulers can no longer reliably have personal interactions with the entirety of their subjects, thus lessening the efficacy of their De. The combined effect of this is that rulers can no longer rely on spontaneous voluntary submission and instead must begin to make use of force and manipulation. The warriors have the blessing of heaven, so to speak, to engage in these sorts of activities in the name of the greater good. They hold what Max Weber called an ethic of responsibility, a duty to engage in the public sphere in a fashion that would be unacceptable in the private sphere. This is recognized by Plato. Quote, "Further, truth must be taken seriously too, for if what we were just saying was correct and a lie is really useless to gods and useful to human beings as a form of remedy, it's plain that anything of the sort must be assigned to doctors while private men must not put their hands to it. Yes, he said, it is plain. Then it's appropriate for rulers, if for anyone at all, to lie for the benefit of the city in cases involving enemies or citizens, while all the rest must not put their hands to anything of the sort." End quote, from Plato's Republic. It would be monstrous for a warrior to engage in violence, theft, and deceit in their private lives. In governing mass societies, however, the moral calculus changes such that it would be unacceptable for them not to engage in such activities. To illustrate, one may think of the Buddhist emperors of Vietnam, who, in their piety, abolished the death sentence. The disorder that followed necessitated the reinstatement of capital punishment by the Vietnamese Ru. The nature of the warrior, as I have argued on another occasion, is such that there is a possibility that, in the context of a metaphysically grounded society, they may transmute such essentially sinful behavior into an avenue to spiritual transcendence. One should, however, abstain from an overly romantic view of the past. That such transcendence is a possibility for the warriors does not mean that it was always a reality. Living as they do in the later days, the wrongs warriors engage in for the collective good were often, if not usually, engaged in with minds that were less than pure. Their acts cannot therefore be without blemish. This point leads us to observe a further ethical dimension of kingly rule. The warriors take upon themselves the moral responsibility of the evil necessarily involved in ruling. Even if they cannot transmute this evil into good through their inner attitude to it, they nonetheless have the virtue of shouldering the blame for the evil acts necessary for the well-being of mass society, absolving of guilt the masses who benefit from these acts. This could be seen as an extension of the function of royalty as sacrificial kings, as discussed by Fraser in The Golden Ball. In more primordial times, the king would, both symbolically and literally, take on the risk of activities necessary for the welfare of the collectivity. An instructive example of this is the tasting of the first of freshly caught fish to test if they are poisonous. In the same way that the early kings assumed the physical risk for the collective, the later kings bore the moral risk for the masses. Perhaps the most prominent symbol of this royal function is Christ's crown of thorns. Christ's crown simultaneously embodies the archetype of Christ the King and Christ as sacrifice for the sins of man. To quote Kate Crosby, this can also be seen in the traditional Theravada understanding that righteous kings who undertake violence in order to preserve law and order are bodhisattva in Sanskrit, because they take on the bad karma of their role for the benefit of the many. Further, the same attitude is to be found in the prayer offered to heaven by King Tang, founder of the Shang dynasty, as quoted in the Analects 21. Quote, "If I transgress, let not the 10,000 states suffer because of me, but if the 10,000 states transgress, the guilt is mine alone." In democracy, because rule is not a restricted activity, but the concern of the whole populace, necessary acts of wickedness are no longer something done by the warriors for the sake of the many, but something the many authorize in their own interest. The violence, theft, and deceit of the state is no longer an act of charity by the rulers, but something self-serving on the part of the masses. The astute viewer will observe something of a contradiction between the preceding statement and what I have argued earlier. That the evils perpetrated by the state are the responsibility of the masses contradicts the notion I have insisted upon that no unified will can be derived from the masses, nor that whatever opinion may be agreed upon by a majority of voters constitutes a coherent or stable set of positions. How can this be reconciled with the statements of the previous paragraph? This is, in the main, not a problem for perennialists or other defenders of traditional monarchy, but for democrats. If the governance of a mass society requires the execution of evils, a democrat is forced to admit that the masses are implicated in this in democracy, and that monarchy is morally superior, at least in that the rulers take this sin upon themselves. In conclusion, sacred monarchy is superior to democracy because monarchy is legitimate and just, where democracy is illegitimate and unjust. Monarchy is legitimate because it is legitimized by a real entity, while democracy is legitimized by a fictional entity. Sacral monarchy is just because it accords with caste. Those who fulfill themselves best by governing, fighting, and administering justice are occupied with those roles. The vast majority of any populace will not only not find transcendence in such functions, but will be disfigured by engaging in them. In sacred monarchy, unlike in democracy, these people are not forced into such an inappropriate role. Finally, where democracy morally debases the masses, in monarchy they are insulated from being so morally compromised, while the aristocracy are ennobled by their involvement in politics. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description.